Right, let me invite the ministers up onto the platform, please. And with thanks to Madam Mogherini, let me move forward with the other ministers. I hope there are 5 of you, or are you not wanting to come onto the platform? Can I invite, please, MJ Akbar, I can see you coming up. Thank you. I'm sorry I haven't been able to say hello to everyone. Hello, nice to see you again. Yes, we did, in the Vatican. Nice to see you. MJ here. Nice to see you. Right, please can we keep the same idea and the same spirit of conversation, if it's possible, with 1,000 of you in this room. But use that if you can. We don't have a lot of time. We have to be out of here by 10 to 7 because the next session is at 7 o'clock, so it's an absolute drop-dead moment. But we have to have Minister Lajcak as well before he heads off to the UN General Assembly. So we've got to be short, sharp, and very efficient. We have the ministers from Russia, from the Holy See, from Hungary, from Turkey, and also from India. Minister, I have to ask you, Çavuşoğlu, the Foreign Minister of Turkey, would you like to respond in any way? This is not about speeches, but I'm giving you the right of reply, because you did say in your remarks for the Bled Strategic Times very clearly, you're talking with an optimistic frame of mind on what's going to happen between Turkey and the European Union. We need each other in every respect, but you're worried about what you called blusterous populism getting in the way. When you hear what, I am quoting you correctly, when you hear what Chancellor Merkel said in the debate, just to remind you, it is clear that Turkey should not become a member of the European Union. She said that as part of the election campaign, and Martin Schulz of the SPD said it's time to end accession talks. Does that mean things are becoming even more distant in Ankara?
First, I wonder whether the debate last night was about the elections in Germany or was about Turkey and Hungary. And Erdogan's and Orban's name mentioned more than internal issues last night on the debate. So I think German citizens wanted to hear more about their own internal issues and the problems. This is the problem of some EU member states, and populism is very high. Why populism is so high? Because radical parties are gaining more power and support, and mainstream parties are trying to take back those supports that they lost for these radical parties. So there is a shift, and they are using the same rhetoric, same language of the racist parties in some European Union member states, unfortunately. And there is an election in Germany, and it's not about Turkey, it's not about Hungary, and they better focus on their own internal issues. With regards to the EU-Turkey-EU relations, it is still strategic goal for Turkey. It was our own choice, and we wanted to be a member, full member. And we discussed and negotiated with the then EU member states, and we signed a deal for full membership. And since then, we have been negotiating. Turkey has no problem to open any chapter and to discuss and negotiate any technical issue. Turkey is ready to meet any opening and closing benchmark of any chapter. So for us, there is no problem there. But the problem is the political one, political obstacles that we have been facing.
But you would accept that what has happened since the 15th of July last year has made it significantly difficult when it comes to human rights and respect for law and respect for human rights when large numbers of people have been detained.
Nothing has changed in Turkey since then. But we saw that EU and EU member states didn't support the democracy and democratically elected government in Turkey. And we have state of emergency, so does France. And France actually decided to have state of emergency after a terrible terrorist attack in Paris. And we face similar terrorist attacks maybe 20 times in Turkey, when we never think to bring back state of emergency. It is my government who lifted the state of emergency from southeast part of Turkey when we came to power. And we never actually rethink to bring it back. But the attempted coup is a serious one. We lost 250 people in one night, overnight, and 2,200 wounded. Who did it? Those plotters. And they ran the tanks over the people. They bombed the Turkish parliament and the innocent people on the bridges around the presidential compound. And they fire randomly on people from the helicopters. So what should I do? I have to take measures. That such coup attempt will never happen in Turkey again.
Okay, well,
so,
one final question, if I can, because otherwise
is it a
others
debate
will not
on
be able
Turkey or is it a debate on Turkey?
Well, no, I'm picking
I
up
thought
on...
that we will discuss the new realities and the new vision. Yeah.
But I want to
but
move
I have
on.
no problem to answer any question. Feel free.
I want to move on to the issue of respecting law, sovereign rights, international law, and international treaties. But when it comes to respecting international law and concerns about things like human rights, there is a concern about your country that a significant number of people have been swept up well beyond the issue of the coup or attempted coup, and you're using it as a way to clean up the professional life.
I have to dismiss 25% of the career diplomat from my ministry. Why? Because their loyalty is to this terrorist organization, not to state. Okay? As a foreign minister, do I prefer to lose that many career diplomats in my ministry? No. But I had no other choice. Am I happy? No. But they are the member of this organization. So how can I work with them at my ministry? This is the most sensitive institution of Turkey. So the prosecutor and the judges, their loyalty is to this sick man living in Pennsylvania. And they don't give the judgments according to the constitution and the Turkish legislation. And this is the constitution and the legislations that we have been reformed in the last 15 years since we came to power. And I want to assure you that there is no step back here. If you look at all the reforms that we have made in the last 16 years, all step forward. But those judges and prosecutors belonging to this terrorist organization were not giving to their judgments.
Okay.
Therefore, what would you do? Suppose that there are Daesh members in your state institutions, in UK or in Germany or in France. What would you do? Do you keep them in your ministries or in judiciary or in military? What would you do with them? Or do you dismiss them? When it happens in your country, it's fine. When there is a terrorist attack, you take all the measures. But when it happens in Turkey, you don't care about it.
All right.
As you didn't support us after the attempted coup, that's why the support of the Turkish people to our EU membership has been declined since attempted coup.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's broaden this into, as you say, Minister, a new vision for a new reality. And we have MJ Akbar, who's Minister in the Indian Ministry for External Affairs, but all of you as well. Picking up what Madam Mogherini said about the new reality is a confrontational approach, often, to the settling of issues or asserting of rights and power, even in violation of international agreements and so on. You come here with important news about what has been achieved between India and the People's Republic of China, literally by having dialogue at the top levels. Now, I think that's important because many people out there will be thinking you're being far too pessimistic. Give us important information about what's happened up on the border between India and China, Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh, which didn't seem possible a few weeks ago.
Well, Nick, this confrontation, to use the term you used, the space in which it took place was really near Bhutan. I don't want to get into the specifics of it because, as Mevlüt pointed out, this discussion is about some other subject. But India and China have a history of problems or differences across a very, very long border, stretching almost across the Himalayas. But as mature nations, we have taken a decision that we will not allow disputes or differences to become disputes. I know a lot of the watching world was waiting for drama. And in the end, because we never lost sight of the fact that dialogue is the best way forward in any dispute. Today, I'm very pleased to announce that our Prime Minister is in China for the BRICS conference. And the situation was resolved last week. It again is a display of maturity and of something that the world recognizes but doesn't always do.
Thank you, because that's an important baseline from which to make judgments that some things can be negotiated. And we're talking about several very complex issues at the moment. And I'd like to come to Minister from Hungary. What is your reflection? 2 years ago on this platform, it was at the height of the beginning of the migration crisis. And there were several ministers, and including Donald Tusk on the platform, who really could not believe that it was going to turn into what it's turned into, which in many ways became an existential threat for the European Union and the credibility of many governments. And many on the platform didn't really want to talk about it. What's your reflection now about what you've learned in Budapest, about the ability of the international community to come together? It's all very well having a new vision, but actually the vision in many ways is being corrupted by some very difficult developments.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Carl, for the invitation, and Nick, thank you very much for moderating this panel and allowing me to sit here in such a prestigious group of speakers. I remember very well the summer 2015. I think no one believed that if we meet after 2.5 years, we have to be faced with the same challenge. A challenge which has the same name, but a challenge which has a disastrous impact on the security of our continent. I remember a couple of years back, Europe, at least western part of Europe, was considered to be the most peaceful and most secure region of the world, and now situation is totally different. I remember the last 2.5 years, during which my country was considered as, or at least the government was considered as Nazi, as fascist, as dictatorial, as not respecting human rights, and so on and so forth. We always spoke about the necessity of protecting Europe, protecting our borders, because a huge influx of illegal migrants into this continent would end up in a terrible security situation. And now the new reality in Europe is that the continent has never had to face such a serious threat of terror, and this continent has never been in such a bad situation regarding security than currently. If we look back the last 2.5 years, so many terrorist attacks happened here in Europe, as an outcome of which we have to be aware of the fact that the security situation here has never been that bad. And, you know, we have been speaking about the necessity of protecting borders. We have been speaking about the necessity of making the decision already outside of the European Union who is eligible for an asylum status in Europe and who is not. We have always talked about the necessity of making a differentiation between illegal migrants and asylum seekers and so on and so forth. And now European leaders speak about that. And I know that politics is not a profession where you get the credit, so these sentences will never continue, as the Hungarians have said for the last 2 years. We don't count on that. But the bigger problem is that it is not happening. I mean, protection of border is not happening. We are still not able to make a decision outside of Europe who can come to Europe. And we are still suffering of hypocrisy and political correctness.
But
and just one second, we are fed up.
The Turkish minister has written, irregular arrivals to the EU decreased by 99%.
Yeah, because cooperation and agreement with Turkey works. And here I have to tell you that double standards we are suffering of in European Union is valid here as well. Because now you pose questions to Turkey about human rights, how they deal with these issues. You know, I'm a little bit frustrated about the fact that we we are a little bit more concerned about the human rights of those ones who attempted a coup d'etat against the democratically elected leadership than the coup d'etat itself. And when European Union made an agreement with Turkey to stop the illegal migration, you know, these issues were not very high on the agenda. And since we have made the agreements, these kind of issues are being put forward, I think, too frequently. And I would like to join Mevlüt in a meaning that, in a way, that, you know, Hungary was mentioned last night very often, which is an honor, by the way, because if there's a election campaign in the strongest country of the European Union and your country is mentioned the most or the second most, that's actually an honor. So I wish good luck for the German voters to make a decision based on that.
Monsignor, could I come to you on the issue of migration? Because obviously there are significant moral issues, and we, in so many ways, given the IOM predictions, the warnings from the UNHCR, in many ways we haven't seen anything yet, particularly with the new economic realities.
Yes.
What view is being taken in the Vatican under the new Pope about this, given the enormity of the challenge that is now being confronted?
Yes. Well, I think one of the things that Pope Francis is very aware and wishes the message to be passed over is that indeed this is a global challenge for the foreseeable future. So there are no, in some ways, quick fixes to this problem. At the same time, I think his thought and the thought of the Holy See is in evolution as well, as the problem unfolds in all its complexity and in its gravity. And so, for example, whereas if you remember the early gestures of his pontificate when he went to Lampedusa to receive people, and he has always been very supportive of the generous efforts of the Italian people and government to receive people, and other countries also in southern Europe. The Holy Father does appreciate that the question of integration is also fundamental, that these things have to be balanced. We cannot expect the impossible of people. That is also an ethical principle. And we have to, but at the same time, we have to have a vision of the underlying problems. And this is why some of now of the attention which is being given by European countries, by the European Union, to addressing some of the problems in sub-Saharan region, and also to try and anticipate the problem, avoiding the dangers that migrants do have in confronting the Mediterranean and other routes, that we should try and facilitate that. At the same time, it would be our position that we have to facilitate greater access to legal migration. And the situation is such that we have to look to the future and become involved. We also have to be very careful that in whatever actions we take and regulations we develop and policies which we approve, that we do not undermine the fundamental international instruments which are there to protect those who are genuine refugees and migration. Migration has been a phenomenon of humanity forever, from the time of the Exodus, from the time of throughout the whole of our history. There's always been migration. What we have to do is approach it, and we also have to convince ourselves and convince those for whom we have some responsibility that we can do this. This is not impossible, and that it is a challenge which we need to take up. Thank you.
Thank you, because there is, and I want to move on to Russia and other issues here, but on this issue, I mean, Koki Ishikuka from Doshisha University, how to manage and solve the refugee issue in Europe despite the rise of racism and populism, which, Minister, you referred to as a blusterous populism, as I said earlier. In other words, this is having an impact on the political process in many countries, although Merkel said last night she wouldn't do anything different to what she did 2 years ago. Again, all three of you, before we open it up into wider issues, is this now under control? Do you believe the politicians really have a grip on it, even in countries where it's become a very significant political issue which has polarized the country? Monsignor.
No, I think that is a work in process. I think we have to be realistic.
The answer is no, in other words.
No, yes. No, yes. Yeah, no.
Do you believe, Minister, from the Turkish perspective, that there's been a grip? Because you make a point of saying, and I wanted to check the figure, $30 billion now spent by Turkey on this issue of displaced people, mainly from Syria, of course. But that's a vast amount of money, but complaining that actually the amount of cash which has come to you has not been anything like what was committed.
Well, this is the new reality of the world. There are 65 million displaced people. And this is the highest number since World War II.
But can we just talk about migration, but displaced people broadly rather than Syria specifically?
Let me answer your question. It's not only about Syria. There are displaced people in all over the world. And this is the new reality. This is the theme of the forum of this year. So, and this is the, now we are living the most peaceful period despite all this problem. So this is the new reality. How are we going to face it? And how are we going to actually help those vulnerable people, be in Turkey, in Syria, or in somewhere else? And we have more than 3 billion refugees living in Turkey, and we spent almost $30 billion. What we receive from international community is only about $525 million from entire world. But from the European Union, this is the obligation of the European Union due to the agreement that we signed, we receive additionally 820 million euro. But EU pledged 3 billion euro for 2016 only. And EU also promised to start voluntary resettlement when the figures go down. And the figures went down by 99%, as I mentioned in my article there. And EU hasn't. Why? Because of this populism that you mentioned, because of anti-immigrant sentiment. And it's not only about the politician or about the people who are losing jobs due to the economic crisis in Europe, but it is the media as well. If you look at the media outlets, very negative, very anti-immigrants. How are you going to reverse this trend? Besides those, this racism, xenophobia, discrimination, intolerance, anti-Semitism, anti-Christianophobia, Islamophobia, everything is on high.
Well, from Budapest, Minister Shri.
So how are you going to support those vulnerable people? Because you don't look at the problem from the humanitarian perspective. And while lecturing the human rights to everybody, you never look at the issue from that side, as Europe.
But Minister, where do you think we are now 2 years into this? Because you've heard, I pressed Monsignor Gallagher about this, and he said no, rather than work in progress. What do you think has changed when it comes to migration? Because it's all very well talking about new vision, but there are those who view this with deep foreboding, even if it's a natural part of demographic change and so on. It is a new reality, but a difficult one which has to be coped with by governments like yours.
I think we have to admit that there are still major differences between the positions of the European governments. There are pro-migration governments. There are governments which think that migration poses a huge security threat on Europe. There are governments which think that migration can be a solution to the crisis of demography and labor markets in the European Union. We think totally differently, to the contrary. There are the European institutions and some European member states who still think that relocation and readmission is the answer. We think totally to the other direction, that we have to stop illegal migration at the border of the European continent. We think it's a security issue. Others don't agree with that. So the debates are still there. In the last 2 years, these debates became even more serious, and the fundamental differences are still there between the approaches in the European Union.
All right, well, look, let's broaden this, and please help me set the agenda here. This is not just a discussion between 6 people who happen to be men up on the panel. If you want to come in with specific issues about new vision or new foreboding, please join in either this way or we'll do it in a different way. Minister Meshkov from Russia, when you look at the new vision and new reality, and you look at the Russian military doctrine, this time last year you didn't have the kind of specific agreement there is now between Russia and Turkey, which was signed by the 2 presidents a few months ago. How do you define the change in the security and political landscape here in Europe? When it comes to, I was asking, after all, you saw me ask the Prime Minister of Serbia about the role that Russia's playing there. There is this sense that Russia has a very different view of the way the political reality should develop, particularly in Europe.
First of all, I would like to thank our Slovenian friends to convene us once again here in Bled. When I was looking at the lake, one thing occurred to me, that Bolsheviks who were shaping the future of our world, they usually were going to Capri, to Geneva, and other nice places to work on the issues of the future. So I think that Bled, it is appropriate place to speak and to in the future of all our countries. Second thing, all of us know the theory of Fukuyama of the end of the history, and these last years once again showed to all of us that the end of the history is an apocalypse. And what we have to do is to create such a world order which won't bring us to the apocalypse. And in this sense, the main thing is cooperation. You've managed the questions about Russia, Serbia. By the way, we hear, at least I heard many times in different capitals, but what Russia has to do in the Balkans. We have to do something here since the 18th century. By the way, if you look at, for example, neighboring Greece, their first president was for 6 years the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia. We had some problems with Turks in the Balkans, but nobody knows that with the help of Turkish ground forces, Russian Admiral Ushakov liberated Corfu and created Hellenic Republic, which lasted for 700 years.
I do need to know.
No, what I'm saying.
I do need to know, Minister.
No, I can. Of course, I'm ready to continue about First, Second World War, about monuments here in Slovenia. So we are interested in cooperation with all the countries. By the way, you've mentioned Turkey. We are discussing today the possibility of Turkey accession to EU. We are talking with Turkey about the possibility to go up to 100 billion of trade exchange. So we are interested in such combination in which the Turkey's accession to EU won't hamper our bilateral relations. The same is true to our relations with Balkan countries. You mentioned Serbia, but why you don't mention Slovenia? We have excellent relations with Slovenia, and Slovenia is the member of European Union. Why not to work out formula, maybe a more generic formula, which bring us not to the confrontation, but to the cooperation? And from this point of view, Balkans might be a laboratory of working this new order, because you have, here you have everything, all the positive elements of our today's Europe, but at the same time, many negative elements of our today's Europe. We mentioned migration, but take terrorism. When from certain countries of the Balkans, people with family goes to Syria and other places, participate in terrorist acts, and they're returning back. It's not the illness of this place.
But let me press you, because tomorrow I think she'll be here, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Rose Gottemoller, who's written in the Strategic Times, talking about a revisionist Russia, boosting its nuclear strength, making threats to use nuclear weapons, and according to some NATO allies, violating the INF Treaty by deployment of Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad, neighboring Lithuania and Poland. But the impression that is being left is one of Russia wanting to destabilize Europe as opposed to live alongside it.
I've said it many times, and maybe last time here in Bled. What we want, a stable Europe, because we want predictability and we want sell our gas and oil. And if you want, and this means, for example, gas, a very important infrastructural spendings. Why you are interested to destabilize the partner which is paying for what you are giving him? And I think from this point of view, Europe is also interested in a stable Russia, to have predictability of our supplies. We know that there are extra-continent players who are not interested in this, but I think we have natural interest with Europe talking about stability of our continent. We don't divide us from Europe. We are the part of the continent.
But let me quickly, if I can just push, and then we'll move on to other issues. David Szabo has just messaged that your foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, characterized the current international situation as a transition period to a multipolar, multi-center international order. Where does Russia stand in this envisioned new era? Is there a place for the EU as a player, a pole in its own right in this multipolar world? There's a high degree of skepticism that Russia really wants to respect, certainly the EU, as part of the multipolar world.
Why? We want Russia to be... once again, we are returning to the issue of predictability. For us, when EU is a strong player on the world arena, maybe on some issues we disagree, but for me it is easier when I understand very well that tomorrow, under pressure from somewhere, the EU is not going to change its position. When we're talking about multipolar world, we are talking more is a polyphonic world. You've just mentioned a very important event which is taking now place in China, a BRICS meeting. Half of the population of the world, half of the territory of the world, and very important stake of economy of the world. So, and we have our common views on many issues. By the way, the issue of North Korean crisis. And we always had, if you look in the history, we always had better relations with EU when the things were going well in EU than when EU was going through crisis.
Thank you. Right. Let's move on, if we can, to the implications, picking up what the Minister from Hungary has said about the implications of migration. But we do have to, therefore, ask about something like Syria, which has in the last 5 years created a new realpolitik when it comes to respect of borders, political intentions, the use of military power, and so on. You know, new vision suggests new vision, which is an optimistic vision. Do you, and you're nodding there, Minister, do you see good reasons to be optimistic? People like me can be accused of being far too pessimistic, but looking around, particularly what's happening with DPRK at the moment and elsewhere, it's hard to actually say this is an optimistic moment. But Minister, you're nodding there. When it comes to understanding the new realpolitik and the use of military weaponry, the use of digital weaponry, and the way that's changing stability. Look at Syria.
You know, Nick, I'm representing here the smallest country on stage in every meaning. And based on that, I have to be, I mean, yeah. But that's why I said every meaning, the smallest one.
Let's not have too much of a debate about this.
Okay, no, we shouldn't, because I would definitely win it, because Everybody's bigger than us here. So what I would like to say that representing a small country, I always have to be aware of the fact that what I say might be considered as interesting, but I have a limited chance to be considered as important. So what I can say here is the following. Representing a small Central European country, we have a very clear understanding of history. Whenever there was a conflict between East and West, we were losing. And we just don't want to be losers in the future anymore. So when we argue in favor of a more pragmatic relationship between East and West, when we argue in favor of a relationship based on mutual trust, then this is not because we either are Putinist or Trumpist. This is because we are pro-Hungarian, and we pretty much know that if there is not an agreement between the biggest powers in the world about specific issues, there will be no solution. So as we see now, the major threats to the world will be resolved and will be overcome only in case there is a pragmatic dialogue and a mutual understanding and some kind of an agreement between the big powers, between East and West, if you like so. So our let's say, encouragement, if I can use that word, to East and West is to try to come to an agreement and try to come to a more pragmatic relationship. For example, Nick, when we argue in favor of a pragmatic cooperation between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union, this is not because we would be leaning to either side because we are a member of the European Union. This is because we think that is in the interest of ours. When Donald Trump won election in the United States, by the way, we were happy with it. It doesn't count because we are not Americans, but we were happy with it because we really had the hope that his winning in the election of President of the United States would help to have a more pragmatic relationship between East and West. Now we see what kind of challenges he has to be faced with when he tries to make, or at least I believe he attempts to come to a more pragmatic relationship between East and West. But according to our understanding, without that, there will be no solution for the big challenges that we are faced with globally.
There you heard, Minister. From the Turkish perspective, dialogue. And that's certainly what Madame Mogherini was saying about still the need to have dialogue. It's hard to see how this is going to happen with North Korea. But when you look back, and I've met your predecessors who've tried for tens of times to have a dialogue between Ankara and Damascus, it never happened. And now look where we are. What are you learning? And obviously you had a dialogue with Russia after the shoot down of the Su-24, and that led to something quite significant very quickly in very positive ways. What are you learning about the ability to have dialogue in order to create a new vision as opposed to creating a new dreadful set of realities?
Well, we are always for dialogue. Dialogue for everything and dialogue for solution. And thanks to this good dialogue and cooperation with Russia, we have made a lot of achievements in Syria. And eventually we included Iran to the process, and we initiated Astana process, and it has been working very well. And we don't have direct dialogue with Damascus. For us, Assad regime lost its legitimacy. And this is the regime killed almost 1 million people brutally and used the chemical weapons. And for us, Assad regime is not the legitimate one. But we are for transition. We are for transition, and the political solution is important. And the new system and the regime must be inclusive. And we are working on that issue as well, together with Russian partners and the Americans and the
But can you define a vision
well
for Syria now or not? Can you define a vision
Yes.
for a dreadful
Let me share
scenario?
our vision then. Now we have the de-escalation zones and cessation of the hostilities, and the ceasefire in general is much better. We are consolidating this. And of course, this is excluding the terrorist organization like Daesh and the others. And now there is a better cooperation between Russia and the United States on de-escalation zone, in our fight against terrorist organizations, and so on and so on. But we need to re-energize the Geneva process for the political solution. The best solution is the political solution. And we can do it. And the transition is important. and the inclusive secular regime in Syria is so important because Syria is multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, okay? And let's help them to draft their constitution. Let's assist them to draft their electoral code on other legislation that they need, and let's prepare the country for the election. Meanwhile, every single major country in the coalition and Russia and everybody is for political unity, national unity, and territorial integrity of the country. But when we see that our American allies and some Western allies giving weapons to a terrorist organization, YPG, we are becoming pessimistic. And we have serious concern about the territorial integrity and the national unity of the country. Here we have to be very careful. Instead of working for our own agenda, we need to support Syrians to actually bring them together for the national unity and for political solution, and let's put the ballot box in front of the people.
Minister
Let the
Meshkov,
Syrian people. This is our vision for Syria, and this is what we are working with our partners.
What are the assumptions being made in Moscow at the moment about Syria? I mean, we can't talk about vision. Are we talking about a divided country? Are we talking about a country where, which is essentially full of either those supporting the Assad regime or those who somehow will retain a foothold in the country, but will still be essentially adversaries of the Assad regime? Microphone, please.
What Minister just said, we have a very similar vision of the future of Syria. Unified state, laic state, multicultural state, multi-religious state, and the Syrians, they are to decide for their constitution, for their way of life. Of course,
under a different leadership or not?
What we're saying, if we are talking about the democratic process, in democratic process, you always aim at the elections. What we have to do as international community, we have to guarantee a very fair elections in Syria. And Syrians, they are to decide whom they want to have as a president, whom they want to have as a prime minister of the government. It's up to them to decide our future. What we are trying to do together now, stop violence, to organize humanitarian aid as much as possible, and create political conditions for a final solution in the country.
But yes, you're in a country where, 400,000 people no longer have the ability to vote because they're dead. So, it is a biased kind of election, it'll be.
Once again, you need a political process. Without political process, this political process have to be inclusive. Unfortunately, different opposition groups in Syria, up till now they are moving to each other, but up till now they even can't create a unique delegation for the negotiations. But we can't decide for them. When we decide for other country, the result is dramatic.
All right. MJ Akbar, I'd like to also come to you because it's 3 years into the current leadership under Mr. Modi. You've been a spokesperson for the BJP. And there are those who fear that there's going to be a radicalization in your country. Is that something which could not be a vision, but could be something which might be a dreadful threat to stability of your enormous country?
Nick, I know that you're not, during this discussion, very much interested in India, largely because India creates problems for no one.
I think you're making the wrong assumption.
And certainly not for Europe. So I was quite happy not to be cross-questioned by you. But
let me... I'm trying to get you to summarize India in 3 minutes.
Let me actually address a question. You know, there's a very simple answer to the question you raised. There is absolutely no question of India being radicalized. And if you want a longer answer, we can do it after this discussion. But I do want to address a term that has been raised repeatedly, which is terrorism. We have long experience in faith-based terrorism, and I think we must put that qualification in front. There are many kinds of terrorism, but that terrorism which seeks, that I think countries have experienced, uses or misuses faith in order to spread this. We have to understand what precisely. Now, we are sitting here in what would be called the strategic heart of Europe. And as we think back on the past, I imagine that the principal challenge before all of us together is how, 100 years later, to avoid, as we try and shape the 21st century, how to avoid the trauma of the 20th century. And the biggest trauma of the 20th century was war. War in many, many shapes, many, many kinds. One of the things that is very important to understand is that all through history, all through civilization, the meaning of peace hasn't changed, but the meaning of war changes. War takes on new dimensions, new shapes, new attitudes, new formations, new objectives. The latest principal threat to international stability comes from terrorism. Everyone has faced it sitting here on this panel in one form or the other. Now, when we talk of terrorism, what is the real principle? It is my view, and I hope I get agreement from the panel on this. Certainly it is my country's view, that terrorism is the fascism of the 21st century. And we have to deal with it. We have to deal with it without giving space to quislings, without giving space to Vichy-Frances, without giving and be categorical. Dialogue is a process that is extremely important. We believe in it. I just gave you an example, a living example. But there is no dialogue possible with those who are determined to destabilize regions and have actually been doing so quite successfully. Even in the last 10 years is a very, very evocative example of what happens when you get complacent. Now, the question before us, do terrorists have objectives? Or do they want chaos, or do they want violence principally for the sake of chaos? I mean, Europe has witnessed in the 60s and 70s those who arose and indulged in terrorism principally for the sake of chaos, without well-defined political objectives. The terrorism that we are facing today has two very important political objectives. One, it does not believe in the nation state. Now, the nation state has, over the last 100 years, through the Treaty of, after the Treaty of Versailles with the collapse of empires, actually filled the vacuum that was left behind by empires as well as by colonialism. And the nation state has become the principal building block of the architecture of stability.
But it's under threat at the moment.
Sorry?
It's under threat
in many ways. And the threat is coming from terrorism. And so those of us who believe in the nation state have to unite and come together and fight this menace. Right. And the second, Nick, I would not, but I do need to express a minute more. The second threat is almost as dangerous, which is the use of fear in order to create disharmony or to create walls, invisible walls between people and communities that have created plural societies. Right. Whether that plural society is in Istanbul or whether it is in Europe or whether it is certainly in my country.
All right, thank you.
And the use of fear, it really is having an impact on democratic politics.
Right, what I want to do is find out whether Minister Yurievich from Colombia is in the room. Minister, are you here? Yes, because I just want to, while you're here, given what we've just talked about with fear and terrorism, given what's been happening with the FARC, and also there are still other issues with what you've with the Havana agreement. I'd just like to have the way in which from Colombia, and I should introduce you as Patti Londoño Jaramillo, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs from Colombia. I hope I got that right. But how much your country has changed since the, 3 years of negotiations in Havana to get some kind of peace deal to end 30 years of conflict with the FARC, although there's still a bit of instability. Quickly, if you can.
Yes, thank you so much, and I would like to express our gratitude to the panel. It's been very inspiring. And while we listen to you, we see in Colombia, we managed to close a deal in a very difficult situation. For a long time we had a war. And now we know that it takes more than just finishing a dialogue, finishing a negotiation, and finishing an agreement. And here I have a reflection for all of you regarding this also. The Pope Francis is coming to Colombia in 2 days, and he has a very strong message: is take the first step. And so with this, I would like to motivate also the panelists to see all the divisions we see in the world between East and West that has been referred, and the South as well. All these divisions.
Do you think, can I ask you, do you think that process has now produced a country largely safe, largely with fear removed, or not?
I think the question of fear is very useful, because we have had fear and we have learned to live in fear for so many years. And one of the reasons why I think we lost the referendum, for example, is because of the politics of fear. We bring fear to people so they stick to what they know more. And in our case, we were so used to having the conflict, so we had sort of the identity with the conflict. And changing that identity with the conflict, and changing that identity for peace and all the opportunities you can have. But that means you have to change your framework. You have to change who's bad and who's good. Who can you support in one thing and the other? So that's why, in our case, I think the peace process, and now it's been so incorporated in people. The implementation, of course, will have some challenges, of course. But we are moving forward because little by little, we are seeing the dividends of being in peace. And I think that's why you start by actions, concrete results, to finally see people and convince people that they can move out of fear.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. And in one minute, if you can, Monsignor, that reflection 2 days before the Pope goes. You and I last met at a big water conference, and the Vatican is now much more, and that was in the Vatican in March. That in its own way is an issue which has to be embraced in vision. The fact is, it's not just about conflict, it's about other kind of challenges, which I think the Pope really wants to embrace.
Yes, I think the Pope is, if you like, the theme of this conference, new realities. I think the Pope is trying in many ways to try and instill a bit of courage into us all to face the new realities, to see these are realities, we cannot escape it. In the context of Colombia, which we hear where he's leaving in 2 days' time, there again, we realize that there are different opinions, different perceptions, different degrees of support of the peace process. So his message is very much trying to be a message for all Colombians, that each one of them and each one of us in our particular challenges needs to take that step. It means different things in some ways to different people, but the ultimate goal would be the same.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Ministers, thank you very much indeed. Can I thank all of you? A lot of questions have been embraced in this discussion. Can I ask, having thanked you, if you would kindly clear the platform, because Minister Lajčák is going to join us, the new President of the General Assembly at the United Nations. Thank you.